Hello, I'm Vera Wilt, Riverside Township Supervisor. I welcome you to another presentation sponsored by the Riverside Township Board of Trustees and the Riverside Township Mental Health Board. Other presentations in the series can be found on YouTube at Riverside TV, but today it gives me great pleasure to introduce a program that focuses on veterans.
Greetings. I'm Dr. Joe Troiani, a Riverside resident and also advisor to the Riverside Township Mental Health Board. I'm also a member of our American Legion post, being a retired commander, United States Navy, and professionally, I'm the founding director of military psychology at Adler University. Today, I will be your host on our special program regarding veterans. To my left is Dr. Denise Dailey, and I'm going to have her go ahead and introduce herself and her affiliation. Dr. Dailey?
Good morning. Thank you all so much for having us. We're excited to be here. My name is Dr. Denise Dailey. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the Road Home program at Rush University Medical Center.
Next to Dr. Dailey, Dr. Mayberry.
Thank you. I am Dr. Megan Mayberry. I'm a psychologist at the Edward Hines Jr. VA, and really appreciate you including the VA in this discussion. Thank you.
Good. And last but not least, Dr. Klassen.
Hi, I'm Dr. Brian Klassen. I'm the clinical director at the Road Home program at Rush, and I'm also an associate professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at Rush.
Good. Well, first of all, I welcome all of you here today to our beautiful Riverside Township building, which I learned a little earlier is 130 years old, but in great shape. And this is a Saturday that we're taping this program, so I especially appreciate you taking your time from your weekend off to be with us this Saturday afternoon, the day of the taping. What I would like to do is give a little background information for our audience, of which I know some of you are veterans, some of you are familiar with the military, but many of you might not be. When we talk about dealing with veterans, they're part of a group, and we refer to them as those who are serving as well as those who have served. When we talk about those who are serving, it's about those who are full-time on active duty here in the United States, around the world, or deployed. I could talk about, for example, the 101st Airborne Division out of Kentucky is currently in Eastern Europe, not to mention our various fleets. But most people are surprised when I share this figure with them that half of our military are part-timers. Here in our own Riverside Village, I've run into reservists from the National Guard, the United States Air Force, the Army Reserves, and even our own police force has a Navy reservist as a law enforcement professional. So we also need to pay attention to those who are serving on a part-time basis, and that comprises today's military. They're members of the various reserves as well as the National Guard, which reports to the state. We also have another group of those who have served. They are veterans, but they're retirees. Some of them have completed 20-plus years of military service and are in a retirement status. But we also have a number of retirees that were medically retired because of injuries, wounds resulting from combat or accidents. So they definitely are counted in that group. And of course, we have those who have served in any capacity: National Guard, reserves, active duties, and they're now all referred to as veterans. Also, I want to take a couple of minutes about talking about where do these veterans come from. Well, we have various military branches, which have expanded over the last couple of decades. Of course, we have the founding of the Army, United States Army, in 1776, as well as the National Guard, which at the time was called the militia. So the oldest branch of the service and the largest branch is the United States Army. Soon afterwards, we saw the establishment of the United States Navy. And one of the first ships, the USS Constitution, still an active duty Navy ship, can be seen in Boston Harbor. In a tavern in Philadelphia, what some people say is most appropriate, we saw the establishment of the United States Marine Corps during the Revolutionary War. Post-Revolutionary War, we saw the establishment of the Coast Guard, which was under the Department of Transportation and is now part of the Department of Homeland Security. After World War II, we saw the establishment of the United States Air Force. And most recently, we now have the United States Space Force, which was established, I believe, 2 or 3 years ago. So these men and women who have served in one, and some of them more than one branch of the United States military. Let's talk about those who have served, that is our veterans. And we're going to be informal. Well, drop the doctor title. We all know we're doctors. And I'm going to ask Denise, do you have any information that you could share regarding how many veterans are there? And most interesting, how many veterans are women?
Absolutely. So currently, we have a rough estimate of 20 million veterans who are residing in the United States. We have roughly 500,000 veterans who reside in the Illinois area. So we have a huge need to provide services to this population. It's estimated that 10% of our U.S. veterans are women, and that would result in roughly 2 million women who are currently living in the United States.
Thank you. Thank you. Before we start talking about mental health issues and mental health complications, I just want to draw attention to some of the other issues that are there. The American Legion magazine, for example, a couple years ago had an entire issue devoted to Agent Orange. More recently, another issue was devoted to what has been referred to as the smoke pits, or the smoke damage that some of our veterans experienced while deploying in Afghanistan. And historically, veterans have been exposed to toxic substances, and there was recently this passage of an act to honor those and get help for those who were exposed to toxic substances. And these are medical programs that are in the Veterans Administration. And historically speaking, again, just to review, veterans have had medical issues associated with Agent Orange from Vietnam, including late onset Agent Orange. Also, there have been lawsuits regarding asbestos in the military, or exposure to asbestos, which is a cancer-causing, what's the term, element or what have you. Of course, if we go back decades, our U.S. Navy ships were wrapped with asbestos and our tanks were wrapped with asbestos. And these are, again, materials that, in fact, are cancer-producing. We all know about Gulf War I when it occurred, 90, 91, into 92, and there's a condition that's been officially recognized called Gulf War Syndrome. And then most recently, as the American Legion magazine titled, we have the issue with the burn pits or respiratory problems, and now toxic drinking water at a United States Marine Corps base up on the East Coast. I believe it was Camp Lejeune. But these are some of the medical conditions that our veterans are experiencing, and this is in addition to their wounds, amputations, blindness, some of them direct result of enemy action or accidents, and some resulting from the medical conditions which are currently under treatment for. We here in the Chicagoland area, we have one veteran. In fact, we had him out at the university to speak, and he was a triple amputee. both arms and one leg. And it's kind of interesting because his job these days, he goes around and speaks as a motivational speaker. And then we have our own Illinois State Senator, Senator Tammy Duckworth, who was shot down and as a result lost both of her legs and part of her arm, and now is serving in the United States Senate. But we just wanted to highlight briefly those problems that are associated with medical conditions. But we're also here to talk about and dig a little deeper in terms of some of the mental health, psychiatric, or psychological conditions associated with serving. And I think the first thing that comes to mind when there's any discussion regarding that is a condition called post-traumatic stress disorder. And just a side note, I know there's a movement afoot to refer to it as post-traumatic stress injury. And I would like to open it up to our panelists, and maybe I could go ahead and start with Brian, because I've known you've done a number of publications. And for our viewing audience, could you tell us a little bit about what is post-traumatic stress disorder?
Sure. So post-traumatic stress disorder is the only diagnosis in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is sort of the guidebook of mental health diagnoses that psychiatrists, social workers, psychologists will use to assign diagnoses based on the symptoms that they see. It's the only diagnosis in that book to include etiology or a cause, right? And so this book spells out trauma as being actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. And this can be witnessed, it can be learned about in the case of a close friend or family member experiencing this, or the individual themselves could be the recipient of it. The interesting thing about PTSD is that trauma, as I've just described it, is quite common. Epidemiological studies show that over half of U.S. adults experience at least one traumatic event in their lifetime. But when you look at lifetime prevalence of post-traumatic stress disorder, it runs about 5 to 10% depending on the population. We know that veterans and people that serve in the military are at a much higher risk for developing post-traumatic stress disorder. This could be because of a number of things. That's the types of traumas that they're exposed to are more likely to result in post-traumatic stress disorder. Things like combat, traumas caused by other people tend to have a much more severe effect than experiencing a natural disaster or a car accident or something like that. I think also the repeated nature of traumas has something to do with the development of PTSD. There's something very different about experiencing one trauma, but experiencing repeated traumas on a deployment, experiencing multiple deployments, tends to have this additive effect. And there are a lot of theories about how PTSD develops. It's a very complex disorder. There are biological theories, genetic theories. It does tend to run in families. There are sort of differences in brain anatomy, in imaging that you can see in PTSD. I think my favorite theory is that, and I think one that resonates with the veterans that I see at Road Home, and I know Denise also sees at Road Home, is that going through a trauma changes how you think about yourself, and it changes how you think about the world and about relationships. And so when you have someone who, after a trauma, blames themselves or sees the world differently or themselves differently as a result, that's when you start to develop PTSD. There are many symptoms that are part of the diagnosis. There's intrusive thoughts, there's nightmares, flashbacks, avoidance of people or places that remind you of the trauma, avoidance of emotions that might remind you of the trauma, negative alterations in cognitions and mood, which is a fancy way of saying just depression, fear, anxiety, sadness, hopelessness, things like that. And there's also this cluster of symptoms that have to do with chronic activation of the fight or flight response. So difficulty sleeping, being constantly irritable, being difficult to pay attention to things, always feeling like revved up and amped up are all part of that diagnosis. I should say about 20% of the men and women who deployed in the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan developed PTSD. So if you sort of extrapolate that out, that's hundreds of thousands of people. So the scale of this problem is quite large.
Good. Thank you. Megan, I know at the Veterans Administration you have specialty programs for trauma. Can you share with us your perspective on what you see in terms of PTSD cases?
Yeah, so we do have, we have specialty clinics specifically for PTSD. Those are based mostly in evidence-based practices and helping support veterans both get through the trauma and reduce some of what Brian was talking about, those immediate symptoms of PTSD. And we also focus on family support, couple support. We know that veterans don't live in a bubble. They come back, they're in their communities, they're back with their families. So we have found it's really important to be able to support both the veteran and their family and try to help them engage in the community. So we have some of those elements woven through our clinics as well. And I also think another piece that we see that's related to, and if you picture a Venn diagram, overlaps very much with PTSD is the concept of moral injury. And that's the idea, that veterans are in a whole different place in the combat theater and doing things that they might not do on the state side in their civilian life, and what that means, right? They come back and they've done things in combat that maybe are not what is part of their value system or their moral code here, and how to reconcile that. And I think that that pops up for folks too. And I think there are lots of different ways to help support folks with that, and that can be connecting with spirituality and our chaplain service. It can be even connecting with peer support. I'll talk about that a little bit later, but other veterans who have been there and navigated those waters and kind of managing their PTSD as an example that recovery is possible. So we try to kind of integrate some of those elements too, because it is pervasive and it can be debilitating. It's such a challenging thing to deal with. So kind of having some of those wraparound services is something that we try to stress as well.
Good. Denise, your comments regarding PTSD?
Sure. Recently, I wrapped up a research study on how veterans experience being diagnosed with PTSD and how that influences their health outcomes and treatment. And what I found through that research is that most veterans, on the day that they receive a diagnosis, have no clue what that means to them, and they don't receive enough information about the diagnosis and what that looks like across a lifespan. So they felt very much under-equipped to manage their mental health condition independently. Additionally, what we found is that not only do they not have the information that they need to mobilize treatment and get involved and engage in services, but they considered PTSD a terminal mental health condition, or a condition that they would struggle with for the rest of their life. And what we know as clinicians is that's simply not true. There are evidence-based practices and treatment options available that significantly reduce the amount of impairment caused by post-traumatic stress disorder. So that was something that we've spent a lot of time talking about, the Road Home program, how to engage veterans and provide psychoeducation to promote health equity. How do we get connected to marginalized groups of veterans who have historically not had access to care and treatment, and also embody a lot of negative stigma about not only mental health care, but mental health providers. And what we found is that oftentimes there are cultural elements that can influence some of these stigmas, but there's also a cultural aspect of serving in the military and being discouraged about seeking mental health care that us as clinicians were up against. So it's really such a dynamic challenge to engage veterans in mental health care services, but I found that most clinicians are equipped with the skills that they need and also very motivated to serve veterans.
It was earlier mentioned moral injury, and I remember a lecture given by a psychiatric social worker who himself was a Navy brat, grew up on Navy bases, and in teaching his social workers, this is down at the University of Chicago, he said, remember, when you work with veterans, they have seen things they would not want their family to see. They have heard things that they would not want their family to hear about. They've experienced things that they would not want their families to experience. And the last comment was, and they've done things that they would not want their family to know about. And again, it ties into some of the earlier discussion regarding moral injury and the realities of war. I know we were talking about PTSD, and that was a diagnosis that was established in the DSM in the mid-1980s. But you could go back to the Civil War and see it was referred to as the soldier's heart. In World War I, it was called shell shock. In fact, Alfred Adler, who the university was named after, was an Army psychiatrist running shell shock hospitals during World War I. In World War II, it became known more so as combat fatigue, or going berserk, which is the extreme. Combat stress, of course, and it wasn't until years after the end of the Vietnam War that we came back and understood what, in fact, PTSD is. It also leads me into my next question to my panelists is, we're hearing a lot more about TBI, traumatic brain injury. Obviously, could connect that to shell shock in World War I, but because of the main cause of death and injury being IEDs, improvised explosive devices, we're seeing a lot more given to the subject of TBIs. And maybe I could start with Brian. And how would you define, or what is a TBI, and how would you define it for our listeners?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think it, when I think about TBIs, I think about just all the different lenses that you can view something like that through. So I think there's a component of, just kind of physical tissue damage or different kind of damage to different like anatomical structures in the brain. And I think you had it on the head earlier, Joe, saying that, there's, in current conflicts, there's a lot of blast injuries, and just from proximity to exposure to IEDs, or even heavy weapons being fired constantly, close quarters combat of clearing houses, going house to house in a community or neighborhood. These are the kinds of things that, like, your brain gets kind of knocked around and things get tugged on and pulled on. And you can sort of correlate that to different functional impairments. We call it, that's the fancy term. So I think as a psychologist, I'm much more attuned to the difficulties in living that a traumatic brain injury can cause. So it's things like being unable to pay attention, being unable to concentrate on things, struggles with what we call executive functioning. So being able to plan out tasks or focus on completing a task all the way through, so setting goals and things like that. We do also know that TBI is quite common in veterans. So I think, I saw some estimate earlier that maybe 11 to 23% of OEF and OEF veterans have been diagnosed with TBI, and that, I think, accounts for maybe 350,000 instances of TBI since the year 2000. So again, along with PTSD, this is a pretty large-scale problem. Mm-hmm. I think the other thing I would say is that kind of like most things mental health related, and I very much appreciate Megan's comments earlier about moral injury is that PTSD, moral injury, TBI almost never exist in isolation. They're almost always connected with each other, right? Because I think if you have somebody with a traumatic brain injury, there probably was some sort of combat exposure or blast injury that caused that, but it also may result in PTSD. So I think Venn diagrams are a great way to look at this, that a lot of what I said are sort of signs or symptoms of TBI could also be said to be signs and symptoms of PTSD as well.
Megan, I was at a presentation a few years ago, and at the presentation they said there were about 1,600 veterans in the Chicagoland area that are registered and diagnosed as having a TBI. And of course, the Veterans Administration hospitals have developed specialty programs. And can you take a moment to comment on that?
Yeah, so we do have specific programs that focus on TBI and polytrauma, so multiple traumas, often both emotional and physical. Like Brian was saying, they don't happen in isolation. So really having these, again, these wraparound services. I think that there's, one perspective. We try to help manage the hard parts that are going on. Of course, we go through diagnostic assessments and imaging and all of those pieces to try to understand what's going on. And then, the VA has a lot of different spokes to support these folks in different areas, right? So just because you have a TBI, it is not game over. That does not mean that you are forever can't engage in your life, right? So we work on, we have a specific program for helping folks in education, pursue their education, get back into the workforce, be able to learn techniques to manage and sometimes even live with some of the symptoms that a TBI comes with, and have that not take over kind of someone's life. So they're still living a life that they value and that have things that are really important to them. So I think, mostly with work, with school, with some of these folks, learning ways to manage day-to-day life so that they can feel successful and engage as much as possible. So I think, the polytrauma TBI clinics have, both the narrow focus of really treating the brain and seeing what's happened, and also this larger view of being able to support case management and being able to engage in your life, even with a TBI.
Often you can't talk about one without the other. If you talk about TBI, you're going to talk about PTSD. And maybe the PTSD is not connected to TBI. But if I was out there listening and I knew very little bit about this, I guess my question would be, what are the prognoses? Do people recover from PTSD? Do people recover from TBIs? I've heard cases in my own circle of veterans here, and of course this goes back a few years that, oh no, he died with his PTSD, or the TBI was an impairment from this point on. And maybe you can enlighten us a little bit about, the hope, the prognosis, and, some of the things that are needed in order to have a recovery.
Sure. Do you mind if I
Sure,
comment
go
on
ahead.
this? One thing, as a family member and a loved one to someone who sustained a traumatic brain injury, Dr. T, we've had a lot of conversations about the care that we provide for my brother, is that there's this miscommon notion that TBI is a single event episode, but really it's the start of a disease process. And it definitely changes over the course of a lifespan and as individuals age. So one of my recommendations as a clinician is to establish care early on, get frequent and often routine neuropsychological testing to identify where your current level of functioning is, and also to monitor if there are any changes as you live your daily life with chronic stress, as we all thrive through, or try to figure out how to thrive through a pandemic. Being activated, experiencing chronic stress can complicate a traumatic brain injury. And other recommendations would probably include some of the EVPs that are available for traumatic brain injuries, such as SMART CPT, which is a hybrid between PTSD treatment and cognitive interventions to help supplement some of the debilitating symptoms of a TBI. There's also CCT, which is a compensatory cognitive training for individuals who've sustained TBIs. That is to help improve some of the neuropsychological functioning that can be diminished due to a traumatic brain injury, such as planning, executive functioning, like how to navigate your day, how to set up a schedule to compensate for some of the memory loss associated with TBIs. And there are other complementary and alternative interventions as well, such as music therapy, hyperbaric chambers, and there's a lot of innovative research happening in those areas as well that can supplement treatment options. But even if you're not experiencing extreme stress related to your injury now, it's good to establish that care just in case in the future there does become some type of difficulty.
Yeah. Megan, anything you would like to share regarding this subject? Prognosis?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm going to be able to list a statistic off the top of my head. You Denise, you might have that more on hand. But I will say that in the context, we know that we have treatments that work, right? We know that for a lot of veterans, we have things that can help with both TBI and PTSD. This is a heavily researched area. We know through research that we have good treatments that can be helpful. I want to say within that context, and I'm thinking of several veterans that I've worked with, which might even be rolling their eyes at me right now if they were watching. And they, the veteran experience with PTSD is to not also forget. So while we have good treatments that can be helpful and can help reduce some of this challenging stuff that's happening, and so that you can live your life, it doesn't erase your experiences. It doesn't erase what has happened. That is still part of you and is part of your recovery process to figure out how to integrate that into your life and into your story. So the treatments aren't set up to make trauma go away. They're not set up to have you forget about your trauma. There's still a lot of work to be done. The idea is that you experience something really, really tough, and we have some treatments that can help support you to move on and continue to live your life in a really meaningful way. So I think that would be my add-on with that.
Brian, I'm well aware of, I've started reading some of the research studies you've done at Rush. Rush University Medical Center Road Home program has published over 50 peer-reviewed research articles, and they have an entire research section for the Road Home program, which is giving us some good cutting-edge feedback. So, Brian, let me go ahead and turn it over to you and again, talk about PTSD, TBIs, what you guys have learned, possibly what you're looking at and studying with studies underway.
Oh, yeah, sure. I think I'll just start by echoing what Denise and Megan have said is like treatment works. Like we have, I think, I think it's just deeply unfortunate. And if I could go back in time and sort of unravel things, I would really try to work more on the kind of stigma and this like cloud that has descended over PTSD and TBI. And like I very much appreciate what Denise said earlier about the experience of receiving a PTSD diagnosis is sort of viewed as this terminal condition, and it does not need to be. There are things now that exist that can really help move the needle. And I think it's kind of on us as a profession, whether you're in a program like Road Home or a clinician in the VA, to try to really kind of get that message out and also try to engage veterans like on their terms, right? And this is why I very much appreciate like the peer support programs, that Megan's doing at the VA. But also programs like Road Home, where we'll move mountains to try to get folks engaged in treatment, whether it's traveling, putting them up in a hotel while they're with us, all of that stuff, because we believe so much in what we're doing and we have the evidence. I can just cite a couple things, in a program like Rush, which isn't all that unique. I mean, we're doing some pretty cool things, but I think, I want to highlight these are things that are going on in a lot of VA medical centers and in a lot of other academic centers in the country as well. But we have a 2-week intensive outpatient program for PTSD, and we've been running it for years, and we know that within 2 weeks we can reduce PTSD and depression symptoms significantly, meaningfully within 75 to 80% of people that are in the program. Even 50% of those people fall below diagnostic criteria for a PTSD diagnosis. So even in a program like 2 weeks, we can make such rapid progress through intensive psychotherapy, group therapy, art therapy, acupuncture, all of those things kind of have this synergistic effect and really moving along somebody rapidly. I think this is something that was probably inconceivable like 20 years ago. And so it's just really nice to be a part of that and kind of spread the news. I will say we're looking very hard at what we can do to augment this treatment. So we're looking at doing repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation. This is a really complex thing. I really don't understand it, to be honest. It's just like jump-starting someone's brain with a powerful magnet, right? So that they are better able to absorb the information that they get in sessions. They're better able to access memories. They're just better able to participate in their treatment. This is a clinical trial that we'll be rolling out at Rush pretty soon. The other thing we're looking at is stellate ganglion block, which is injecting anesthesia into a bundle of nerves in the neck, which connects to the amygdala. The amygdala is a brain anatomical structure that's responsible for like fear, anger, negative emotions, things like that. So if we numb that bundle of nerves, we can suppress activity in the amygdala. And the idea there is that it makes the therapy where you go through traumas in detail much easier to do, right? And so it kind of lowers that intensely high threshold that can be a barrier for a lot of people. It kind of lowers that threshold, and hopefully we can reach more people with that and make the therapy, the work a little easier to engage in. So we'll be rolling that out soon as well.
Good. Thank you. Some of the other issues dealing with veterans include homelessness, and often substance abuse is tied into that. Myself, when I started working at the VA, I worked as a substance abuse counselor with the program that was called the Drug Cure Program, at the time Westside VA. But the VA was pretty much cutting edge. In 1970, 71, 72, they were starting to roll out institutional programs that later on the state as well as the not-for-profit sector followed. So the VA kind of led the charge in that area. But Denise, I know you've done work, field work, and some writing in the area of homelessness on veterans. And if you could share some of your observations regarding homelessness.
Sure. Working with veterans who experience homelessness has definitely shaped everything about who I am, and it has moved me as an individual and a clinician. As the daughter of 2 combat veterans, it was very surprising to me that so many individuals could slip through the cracks of a system that was really designed for them. And what I found is that minorities in particularly are overrepresented in veteran homelessness, and also older adults. Especially from our Vietnam campaign era. Veterans who experience homelessness are more likely to be re-traumatized while in homelessness. They're less likely to engage in care at the VA and more likely to engage in care in the community for a myriad of reasons. They're less likely to be compliant with treatment options that are outlined by their providers, and more likely to have a world that has been largely affected by their mental health condition. So having difficulty working due to untreated mental health conditions, having difficulty showing up in their marriages and for their kids and within their family dynamics, and really walk through life with a fear of being traumatized and an openness to engage in really maladaptive behaviors for survival. And all of those things can complicate other pre-existing mental health conditions and their physical health. We are working very hard to connect veterans who are experiencing homelessness and with evidence-based treatments and some of the innovations that are available. Myself, I've been a part of a lot of public health campaigns to increase complementary and alternative medicine for veterans who experience homelessness, such as equine therapy, music therapy. We have expressive arts groups that are running in local homeless shelters in the Chicagoland area. And most importantly, we're working to reduce the stigma, because this is a group of individuals who has been mistreated by clinicians or maybe not believed. And so the trust that they have in us and the trust that they have in our system and the work that we do has been largely affected. So myself as a clinician and also my team at the Road Home program, we're doing a lot of outreach right now just to rebuild that trust. Show them that we are people that can show up for them, give them a space to show up and express the experiences they've had within healthcare settings that have been less than positive. So we're really working hard to not only rebuild trust, but also provide accurate diagnosis. Oftentimes there's misdiagnosis or missed diagnosis that can result in individuals kind of leading their lives with untreated mental health conditions. And that's where you get the substance use, because people are coping in the best way that they know with the tools that they have to feel better.
Megan, I know the Veterans Administration has a number of specialty programs in this area. Can you share with us from your perspective the type of programs you have to address homelessness or substance use, or maybe some of the other issues that we haven't mentioned so far?
Yeah, so let me think how to be concise and succinct here. We do have a robust homeless program that works towards not only housing individuals. We have a full range of being able to have immediate access, right? So if someone comes in who is homeless, they have immediate access to our program. We also, if we have a direct call line to Hines, and if someone knows a homeless veteran, or we say, hey, there's someone who's a homeless veteran on Harlem and Cermak, we deploy a social worker immediately, and we go and connect with them, and we talk about services and do that. So we really work on the front door and the access, and it's hard. It's a struggle to get folks engaged. We also have 5 peer support specialists in our homeless program, and that is in efforts also, as Denise was talking about, the mistrust and the cracks that are inherent in every huge system. The peer supports often try to say, hey, I've been there, I know what this road is, I'm gonna walk down this road with you, and we're gonna get you set up. And so I think we work towards that front end. We have a lot of resources. We have transportation resources and housing, and even getting the moving supplies and getting people furniture and set up and food, and so it's a well resourced program for as far as homelessness goes. The VA has a lot of treatment with substance use. We have all across the spectrum, right? So we have traditional outpatient care, meaning you come in and work maybe in groups or with a therapist. We have more intensive, where you might be coming in a couple times a week to help maintain sobriety or figure out what your goals are related to substance use and how to support you to get there. And then we have a 21-day residential program, at least on the Hines campus. So we do have a range of substance use treatments for that. And I do want to say, too, that, Hines also, there's a significant amount of veterans that also have been diagnosed with serious mental illness. So that's psychosis, schizophrenia, bipolar. Those are debilitating disorders that can be really tough and also treatable, right? So we have a pretty comprehensive wraparound treatment program with this. We have several programs, like, we have the Psychosocial Rehabilitation Recovery Center. We have case management that goes out to people's homes and communities to try to help them engage and support support. We have an early psychosis intervention team that tries to connect, also getting folks into the workplace. So we have a robust treatment wraparound service for those folks also. I always like to put in a plug for that population too, because it is pretty significant, and there is also treatment that works and can help support those folks. And I'm going to do also a quick plug, and then I'm going to stop talking. With folks that are struggling with suicide, that has been a VA top issue for a long time. It is a lonely, dark, tough place to be, to think about taking your own life, and VA has a lot of services to help connect. We have an intensive outpatient service that can keep you out of the hospital if that makes sense in your goals, but also really work towards getting your life back on track. There's specific evidence-based treatments specifically for that can be really meaningful and helpful. We have a dialectical behavior therapy program, which is also targeting that in addition to some other challenges. So that is another area that we are really dedicated to providing support for veterans.
It's often said that the forgotten persons are the partners, the children, the families. And I know with the Road Home program, an important cornerstone is engagement of the families. Mm-hmm. Brian, if I could have you talk a little bit about what you see in terms of the impact on family and partners and what the Road Home program is doing to address that.
Yeah, I think it's, I'm forgetting who said it earlier, but I appreciate it. Like, there's veterans don't exist in a bubble, right? They're part of families, they're part of communities, they're part of social networks, and so I think as much as we want to provide really excellent high quality services to the veteran themselves or service members, I think it also makes sense to include the spouses, the children, the parents, the siblings, right? Everybody in the veteran social circle. And just reflecting on some of my personal experiences as a clinician, I cannot tell you the number of times that I've worked with veterans that have, after a successful course of PTSD treatment, will lean forward in their chair and say, my wife doesn't know any of this. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm. Or, I don't know how to, I'm feeling so much better, but my kids are scared of me. How do we talk to them about how I'm different now, but I'm not out of the woods. I'm not fixed, and so I think it's, and also from an empirical perspective too, I think the literature is pretty clear that I think one way of engaging veterans, because we've talked about stigma, we've talked about how difficult it is to get people to show up for treatment and really go through with it. I think having family buy-in is empirically one of the best ways to do that, right? If you have a spouse and kids and parents and siblings who are all on board and are really on the same page with the veteran, things are much better, right? They attend treatment, the outcomes are better. And so I think one way we've tried to do that at the Road Home program is that, we'll work with spouses, family members, parents, roommates. We define family pretty broadly, but we'll also do therapy for kids. And, a lot of that takes the form of the veterans starting to recover and feel better, but how do we understand this new normal as a family? Mm-hmm. Good.
Denise, you kind of have a unique perspective. You're a doctor in clinical psychology. Mm-hmm. You specialized in military clinical psychology. Mm-hmm. Your mom recently retired from the United States Navy. And your father was medically retired from the United States Army Special Forces. Mm-hmm. Where does that put you?
In a very rough place, especially during those Army-Navy football games. There's a lot of difficult conversations that come up when you are in a veteran family or just care about someone who served in the military. You don't want to see your loved one struggle. It's a very difficult experience. One thing that I absolutely love about being at the Road Home program is that access to care is really emphasized. So when it comes to getting treatment and getting care, the family is considered, and family can be somewhat of a broad term for individuals who receive care at the Road Home program. So there's not just access to care for active duty, reservists, National Guard, veterans, but also their family members as well. And some of the services that are available are very much inundated in over access in the community. So for children of veterans or service members, they're able to get neuropsychiatric services through the Road Home program. You might find a wait time for neuropsychiatric assessments in the community is up to a year. And that takes a lot of stress off of parents who are concerned about their kids and how they're doing, but also have their own individual things to work on in treatment. There's another statistic that shows that individuals who have supportive family systems are more likely to complete treatment. So increasing access to care for the family only better serves our veterans with helping that they'll have successful treatment outcomes in the services that they engage in. So absolutely, you cannot serve a veteran without trying to understand their social context and the people who are in their lives to support them.
So who's going to win the Army-Navy game?
It depends who's going to get me a better Christmas present this year.
We have another 5 minutes, and I want to take some time in having our guests talk about the programs they're affiliated with and what services are available. I know here in the Riverside Township area, we have a vet center right up here on Harlem Avenue on the Forest Park side. And of course, we have Hines Veterans Administration Hospital in the area. But the Chicagoland area has 3 VA hospitals, one up by Great Lakes, and of course, Jesse Brown VA. And if you're interested about the name Jesse Brown, a movie was just released called Devotion, and it's about Jesse Brown, who is the first African-American Navy fighter pilot, and what occurred during the Korean War. So if I could have you talk a little bit about the VA and how do people access services, or how does one go about stepping forward and saying, I need help?
Sure. So, I think if I'm going to be honest with this, the front door to the VA can sometimes feel heavy. Right? It is a huge system that has processes to go through, right? So your first step is to go through eligibility, right? It's late. You can do it. You can come into Hines. You can do it on the phone. You can do it on your computer. There are multiple ways to do it, but the first step is just to submit your DD-214, get in the system, right? Once you're in the system, then it is much easier to navigate, right? So first step is you can Google Hines VA eligibility. It's pretty laid out right there on the internet. You can just come into Hines and say, I want services, right there at the front desk, and we'll help you with that. Then the second step, specifically with mental health, my first recommendation would be if you're already seeing your primary caregiver, talk to your doc, right? Talk to your primary care doctor about anything that you're worried about, any changes that are happening, and they can help you navigate the system and get you into any kind of specialty care that you might need. If you're saying my primary care visit isn't for another 2 months and I am just struggling right now, you can always call our mental health intake. I can give you that number if you want. It's 708-202-8387, extension, I think, 23446. So you call the intake number, they will set up an appointment with you, and you can get in very quickly. And if you're saying that's not even good enough, very quickly, I don't have a week to wait, come in, building 228 to the first floor. We will see you the same day. So just come in, and we will connect and try to find you the best services that we can. It is a huge system. The greatest strength and weakness of the VA is that we have a ton, right? There is so much to navigate. So come in, connect with us, connect with a peer support, connect with a provider, and we will help you navigate and get connected to the plethora of so many programs that we have at the VA.
Now, how is the vet center different? Is that a clinic they could just walk into?
Yes, so you can go ahead. So the vet centers are specifically for folks who have served in combat areas during combat times or who have experienced MST, which is military sexual trauma. So the vet centers are specialized clinics for folks that are readjusting, coming back from combat, or who have served in a combat zone. The VA and vet centers have, the vet centers have some relationship with the VA. They come to our treatment planning meetings sometimes. They're connected, but the VA cannot see your records at the vet center. It is separate. So it is your medical records or any records you have at the vet center do not translate into the VA. Those things are kept separate. They have groups. They have a lot of veterans on staff at the vet centers to help support, and they also do a wonderful job, just like Road Home does, with integrating families and children and that piece too. So the vet centers are a great resource.
Good. The Road Home program is based out of Rush University and Medical Center. In the last year, Rush was awarded the distinction of being one of the top 25 hospitals in the United States and one of the top 3 hospitals in the state of Illinois. It was also recently recognized by the Wounded Warriors Foundation with a significant grant to help pay for services offered through the Road Home program. Can you tell us a little bit more about the program, what's available, and how would somebody access those services?
Yeah, I'll start with access. We have, as Joe mentioned, a physical clinic on the west side of Chicago, or the West Loop in Chicago, on the Rush University Medical Center campus. We also have a satellite clinic in Effingham, Illinois, which is downstate, and that's headed up by Dr. Blake Schroeder. He's a proud alumni of Adler University, and Joe taught him a long time ago. But yeah, great guy. And we're also able to offer telehealth services throughout the state of Illinois. So in order to access Road Home services, just call 312-942-8387. You can also go to our website at www.roadhomeprogram.org. There's plenty of information there. There's also a place to sort of send us an email that'll go to an account that will help register you. All we really need is like a DD-214. We can take an NGB-22, record of National Guard service, things like that. I think some interesting things to know too about eligibility is that we are able to take people that are not VA eligible because of like dishonorable discharges or bad conduct discharges, or things like that. So we're often, I think, a good option there. And as Joe mentioned, we're philanthropically funded. So even though we're operating out of Rush University Medical Center, there is no out-of-pocket cost for the veteran, service member, or their family. We're funded by the Wounded Warrior Project, by the McCormick Foundation, by the Chicago Bears, a bunch of kind of donors, philanthropists in the community have come together to fund this program. In terms of what we offer, I think I'll best sort of describe it as like 2 programs. And I think, relative to, a place like the Hines VA or Jesse Brown or Great Lakes VA, I think we're pretty small and boutique. So I'll kind of like draw that line. We're pretty like mental health focused. And so for things like Agent Orange or Gulf War Syndrome, we are not equipped to serve those things. We're sort of a PTSD, TBI, invisible wounds of war is kind of what we call it. But we have an outpatient program that is a traditional outpatient program. It's primarily psychotherapy. We do have medication prescribers available, also wellness services, so things like mindfulness, art therapy, yoga, things like that. I think what we're most known for, though, is our intensive outpatient program. And this is a program that's 2 weeks long. It's PTSD focused on either combat trauma or military sexual trauma. And about 95% of the individuals we serve with that program actually travel to Chicago for that program. So we're not serving local people necessarily, although plenty of local people do participate in the program. And we'll cover airfare, lodging, housing, food, all that stuff. So we're kind of, as is like a theme of today's discussion, I think, has been barriers, stigma, things like that. We're really trying to put a lot of resources into moving mountains to get people into like a specialty program like ours.
Good. We're almost out of time. We've got one more minute to go. I would like to thank our panelists again for taking time off on this Saturday, coming here and sharing your knowledge about veterans, families, and most important of all, the resources that are available for those not only in the Riverside Township community, but in the general area. This completes the first segment of our program. We're going to have a second brief segment where specifically we'll talk about some of the local Riverside resources, including our Community Resource Center. So please stay tuned, and again, thank you. Welcome back. I hope you had the opportunity to watch the 1-hour special presentation on veterans. And we're following that with a special presentation on our Community Resource Center. I'm going to turn it over to Susan, who will tell us about the CRC and the resources available, including some discussion regarding what's available for veterans, specifically at Way Back In. So, Susan?
Hi, my name is Susan Bertuglia. I am a licensed clinical social worker at Aging Care Connections, and I'm here with my two esteemed colleagues, Yajaira Jimenez and Jillian Reid. So Yajaira is, and I'm going to read this off to make sure I get it right, she's a qualified intellectual disability professional over at UCP Seguin, and Jillian is an outreach and community resource specialist from Way Back In. And the three of us are here today because we are the individuals who staff the Community Resource Center, or the CRC as we call it, on a part-time basis throughout the week. And our primary role and goal is to connect Riverside Township residents, although we will not turn anyone away, regardless of their zip code, but our goal is to connect individuals and families with any information or resources or services that they might need in order to help them just live successfully and safely in the greater community.
Thank you, Susan. Again, my name is Jillian from the Way Back In, and we for the CRC are located at Riverside Town Hall at 27 Riverside Road in Riverside. We can be reached via phone at 708-853-9578. The CRC can assist with connecting residents to a variety of programs such as aging services, intellectual and developmental disabilities, benefits counseling, mental health referrals, substance use and gambling disorders, as well as housing and much more.
Thank you, ladies. The Community Resource Center is open Monday, Wednesdays, and Thursdays from 9 a.m. to 11 a.m. and from 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. and Saturdays from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. The Community Resource Center is a service of the Riverside Township Mental Health Board, and we are proud to be making a difference in our community.
And in closing, we have a resource that provides services for veterans over at Way Back In, and if you could share with us a little bit about that program.
Absolutely. Just to touch on that real briefly, the Way Back In has been partnering with the Hines Veteran Administration Hospital since about 2013. And through that, we do operate a homeless veterans program that is designed to offer our substance use and gambling disorder treatments to homeless veterans. The VA covers the fees associated with that, and it usually runs about 90 days, I would believe. But it's a wonderful program, and we are very proud to be able to continue to offer it as we have since, like I said, 2013. So.
Thank you all for being here, and thank you for the work that the Community Resource Center is doing, and an appreciation to the Riverside Township and the Mental Health Board for helping to fund this particular project. A very important value to our community and resource in our community. So thank you and good day.